Highway 16 runs from the west coast of British Columbia east out of the province. The 720-kilometer span of highway between Prince Rupert in the west and Prince George in the east is what has become known as the Highway of Tears.
We're here in Prince George, which is the largest city in northern British Columbia. About 70,000 people live here. And this is also the edge of what people call the Highway of Tears, which is Highway 16, 724 kilometers between here and Prince Rupert on the coast.
It cuts through the traditional First Nations territories of the Delketh, Wet'suwet'en, Gitsken, and Tsimshian, names describing how they are people of the river, the Skeena River.
This stretch of road is better known as the Highway of Tears, a nickname that hardly came by accident.
All the victims were female, between Prince Rupert, British Columbia, and Prince George, British Columbia. This road came to be known as the Highway of Tears.
The Highway of Tears refers to a stretch of highway, which is Highway 16 between Prince George, British Columbia, and Prince Rupert, British Columbia. For the purposes of this story, I would also include corridors that go all the way down to Fort St. John, British Columbia, Dawson Creek, British Columbia, and even into Grand Prairie, Alberta, as we've heard stories being local of Indigenous women disappearing. Now, throughout this corridor, we know that there's been 18 documented cases of murder or women that have went missing. Some of the vulnerabilities that contribute to the Indigenous women going missing or murdered are drug use, having to go from town to town to see family members, to pick up medicine, to go to work, to even go to school. And many Indigenous did not have cars at the time, even to this day, to be able to travel from one end to the other. So they've got to go hitchhiking, which puts them at risk every time they put their thumb out to get a ride. Now you add in the fact that there wasn't a lot of attention on the Highway of Tears until late 2000s. This meant that for 50 years, a lot of these cases didn't have a lot of attention that were given to them. Even to this day, there's only 18 confirmed cases according to the RCMP, but if you talk to locals, there's far, far more than that. As a matter of fact, if you go to Wikipedia, you'll see that there's 80 cases that are on there, and you'll see some of the details of those cases. Furthermore, if you ask the locals, they say that this has been ongoing far longer than the 1970s, even though it was 1970 when the first case was recorded. You got to keep in mind, back in those days, these weren't recorded. And because of the systematic racism that was experienced in Canada, there wasn't a lot of attention that was given to the Indigenous people, specifically in this case, Indigenous women and girls. So there's no records prior to 1970. Unfortunately, this story aligns well with the residential Indian community school systems that we've heard so much about in the last few years, where the authorities are finding grave sites and starting to correlate some of the missing Indigenous kids from as far back as the 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. That being said, welcome to my channel. I'm your host, Tim Sahlberg. Today, this video is a little bit thicker, but we do want to go through, at the very least, the 18 victims that the Highway of Tears has taken, and talk a little bit about the highway itself so you get a good understanding of what's going on. A little bit different video for me. This is not going to replace my current content by any means, but I did want to do more of a documentary style of something that's important to me, as well as what's important to some of the viewers that have requested that we continue to do coverage on some of the Indigenous people. As you've seen on my channel, I have featured some that had went missing in Canada prior. You'll see that in some of my previous videos, and we'll continue to do that as well. All right, so let's jump right into it. As stated before, the Highway of Tears is a 719 kilometer or 447 mile corridor of Highway 16 between Prince George and Prince Rupert in British Columbia, Canada. There are a disproportionately high number of Indigenous women on the victims list. Proposed explanations for the year-long endurance of the crimes and limited progress in identifying culprits include poverty, drug abuse, widespread domestic violence, disconnection with traditional culture and disruption of the family unit through the foster care system, and Canadian Indian residential school systems. In the intro, I talked about that a little bit, and you've got to think, if you read into those stories, which we may do a video later on that, is that many people, especially of Indigenous descent, would be afraid to come forward based off of what they saw in these schools. And this is part of the systematic racism that we hear about today. Many of the folks that went missing or murdered on the Highway of Tears would have experienced or had somewhat of an experience firsthand of the residential schools that we're hearing about today, where many kids had either went missing or have been found in a grave recently. Keep that in mind as they are working through all the previous things that we talked about that were challenges to these females to either go to work, pick up their medicine, go to school, see family members. Many of them didn't have vehicles or know somebody that had a vehicle, so they had to go hitchhiking to get from one place to the other. Some were high risk, of course, doing drugs, things like that, absolutely, but not all of them. And when somebody is going from town to town, they shouldn't have to worry about what's going to be lurking behind the wheel of a car that stops to pick them up. To this day, like I stated before, locals do say that there's far more than 18 that have went missing or that have been murdered. If you check out the page on Wikipedia, you're going to see that there's 80 plus victims on that page alone that we could talk about. Locals have also stated that this has been ongoing long before 1970, where the first case has been documented. But because of systematic racism that has happened in Canada prior to being brought to the forefront in the late 2000s, it wasn't either taken seriously, the proper resources weren't put on it, or the lack of attention for Indigenous women and girls was very apparent. Now, we see this in both the residential schools and the Highway of Tears, but for this video, we're really focused on the Highway of Tears. When I was growing up, we called it the Lost Highway. Now, a lot of it were stories that we heard from our friends, our parents, our grandparents, so on and so forth. And most of the time we'd hear it to correlate that we shouldn't go out hitchhiking. Now, we did know it was a higher risk for females, but it was still a risk all the same. That's why I say the road itself could extend all the way down through Fort St. John, British Columbia, Dawson Creek, British Columbia, and Grand Prairie, Alberta. So this highway has been around a long time. Now, once I was in high school, things had changed, and that's when the term was coined Highway of Tears. A couple other things that we want to talk about in this is just the investigation and suspects. The first investigation by the RCMP that tried to look at the Highway of Tears as linked cases was opened in December 1998. So that's almost 30 years after the first victim. The big name that comes out today is Bobby Jack Fowler, which was implicated in numerous non-Highway of Tears EPANA cases. Fowler died in prison and has never been charged in the deaths of any Highway of Tears victims. So that's pretty interesting. In 2009, police converged on a property in Isle Pierre in rural Prince George to search for the remains of Nicole Hoare, a young tree planter who went missing on Highway 16 on June 21st, 2002. The property was once owned by Leland Chuggy Vincent Switzer, who served a prison sentence for the second-degree murder of his brother and is out on parole as of late 2016. The RCMP also searched the property for one other missing woman. The Highway of Tears, however, no further actions followed the investigation. And anytime there's something this big or this serious with this many victims, there's always going to be a scandal. You're always going to have the people that believe, the people that tell stories, the people that embellish stories, and the people that just know. Now, it's hard to decipher through that if you have never experienced it, and that's why we want to bring it to the forefront, because this stretch of highway is very real. You couldn't write a horror story that would take more people in the entire movie or book than what we've seen on the Highway of Tears. So that being said, we want to look at the scandal that the government had with some of the emails that were being sent. Bear with me, I'm going to read this one word for word out of Wikipedia. In an official government report, Ministerial assistant George Grates was accused of being irresponsible for triple deleting all emails relating to the Highway of Tears. On 22nd October 2015, Elizabeth Denham, the Information and Privacy Commissioner of British Columbia, published a 65-page report outlining how BC government officials had triple deleted emails relating to the Highway of Tears. In her report, Access Denied, Denham described the act of triple deleting as transferring an email to the deleted folder on a computer system, deleting the email from the folder, then overriding the backup that permits the system to retrieve deleted items. By deleting these files, Denham states the government had breached the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. Denham became aware of the scandal in May 2015 after she received a letter from Tim Duncan, the former executive assistant to Transportation Minister Todd Stone. Duncan claimed that as he was responding to an FOI, Freedom of Information application, Ministerial Assistant George Grates ordered for Duncan to search his records for any files pertaining to the Highway of Tears and missing women. Once the files were located, Duncan testified that Grates ordered for them to be deleted. When Duncan hesitated, Grates allegedly took the keyboard and triple deleted all the emails relating to the Highway of Tears. According to Denham, Grates originally denied this claim but later admitted to triple deletion during a second police interview. Denham states that Grates, who resigned from his job in October 2015, would have lied under oath. A year earlier, in the summer of 2014, a team from the Transportation Administration toured Highway 16 and conducted numerous meetings with Aboriginal leaders and communities. The significance of this project was to produce safer travel solutions for women living along Highway 16, many of whom had turned to hitchhiking as a way of transportation. In November 2014, the NDP made the FOI request seeking all government files pertaining to missing women. The Highway of Tears and meetings arranged by the ministry, the report Duncan would later respond to. Despite a 2-month tour and multiple meetings, the BC government claimed the FOI request produced no files relating to the Highway of Tears. According to Denham's report, these records did exist until government officials destroyed them in order to skirt Freedom of Information laws. In Access Denied, Denham called upon the RCMP to further investigate the triple deletion of government files. In November 2015, Vancouver lawyer Mark Jetty was appointed as special prosecutor within the RCMP investigation. Jetty will act as the RCMP independent legal advisor as well as administrator and independent assessment of the evidence. He will also pursue any criminal charges that may be found appropriate. Grates was convicted of 1 count of lying to the British Columbia Privacy Commissioner and fined $2,500. So based off all of that, what do you have in the story so far? 1, you know that the story is true, at least for 18 victims. But again, according to locals, there's far more victims than that. And you can see it on Wikipedia, almost 100 victims that have been named and more to come. 2, the highway going through Highway 16, again, my opinion, all the way to Grand Prairie, Alberta, is not safe specifically for Indigenous females, girls, and women alike. 3, you always get a government scandal when stuff like this happens. Why are we trying to cover this up? Don't we want our females to be safer? Don't we want our people to be able to travel from one city to the next? Not everybody can afford a vehicle. Not everybody can afford to live in the city. And lastly, the sadness that comes with all the people that have disappeared with no suspects to date is absolute insanity. Just imagine, for sure, 18 people that have been killed, murdered, or gone missing due to somebody else. But the possibility that there's hundreds more should keep everybody on high alert. So does that mean there's one person, multiple people? Or is it just because people think they can get away with this along this corridor of highway or stretch of highway? What can we do to make this better? So right now, I'm going to take the time to highlight the 18 victims that we know of so far. But again, I encourage you to go onto Wikipedia and look at all the victims. Gloria Moody. Last location was Williams Lake. She was last seen on October 25th, leaving a bar in Williams Lake. Her body was found in the woods at a cattle ranch 10 kilometers away. Ethnicity, First Nations. Michelin Parr, 18. Last seen on Highway 29 at the gates of Tompkins Ranch, situated between Fort St. John and Hudson Hope. 2 women who had given her a ride had dropped her off there. Her body was found at Hudson Hope on August 8th. Caucasian. Gail Ways disappeared while hitchhiking from Clearwater to Kamloops. Her body was found in a ditch on Highway 5 south of Clearwater. Person of interest, Bobby Jack Fowler. She was Caucasian. Pamela Darlington, 19, homicide, vanished from Kamloops while hitchhiking to a local bar. Her body was found the next day. Bobby Jack Fowler is the person of interest, also Caucasian. Monica Ignis. She was believed to be going home from school when she was last seen at 11 p.m. on December 13, 1974 in Thornhill. She was walking home alone. Her body was found in a gravel pit or a densely forested area on April 6, 1975, east of Terrace, near Selgar Forest Service Road. 2 witnesses reported seeing a car pulled over on the side of the road the night Ignis vanished. The pair saw a man and a passenger who looked like a girl inside the vehicle. Monica had been strangled. Caucasian. Colleen McMillan, homicide, 100 Mile House. Last seen leaving her home in Lac Hatch to hitchhike to a nearby friend's house. DNA evidence reveals a match to convicted American rapist and murder suspect Bobby Jack Fowler, who had died in prison in 2006. He had been working in BC in 1974. She was Caucasian. Monica Jack, only 12 years old. 1978, Monica Jack was last seen riding her bike on May 6, 1978, near Nicola Lake. For 17 years after she disappeared, Jack's fate was unknown. In June 1995, forestry workers found skeletal human remains in a ravine off a logging road on Swacum Mountain, about 20 kilometers or 12 miles from where Monica's bike was found. Dental records and DNA testing confirmed her identity. Gary Taylor Hanlon was charged October 22, 2018 for the murders of Monica Jack and 11-year-old Catherine Mary Herbert. On 18 January 2019, Hanlon was convicted of first-degree murder of Monica Jack. She was First Nations. Maureen Mosey, 33, died in Kamloops. Maureen Mosey, 33, was believed to be hitchhiking from Salmon Arm to Kamloops in BC Interior when she was last seen on May 8, 1981. Her body was found the next day by a woman walking her dog along the road off the Trans-Canadian Highway about 16 kilometers or 9.9 miles east of Kamloops. She had been severely beaten. Caucasian. Shelly Ann Basque. Several days after disappearing, personal items including clothing and blood droplets matching her blood type were found near the Athabasca River. Caucasian. Alberta Gail Williams. Alberta Williams went missing on August 25, 1989. Her body was found on September 25, 1989, about 37 kilometers or 23 miles east of Prince Rupert, British Columbia, near the Tyee Overpass. She had been strangled and sexually assaulted. First Nations. Delphine Nical, 16, from Smithers. Delphine Nical vanished on June 13, 1990. The 15-year-old teenager was hitchhiking east from the town of Smithers, British Columbia. First Nations. Still missing. Ramona Wilson, 16, died of homicide. She was hitchhiking from Smithers to attend a dance and stay with friends in Hazelton, British Columbia on June 1st, 1994. Ramona's remains were found April 1995 north of Yellick Road near the Smithers Airport. Several items were in a small organized pile a few feet away. Other objects nearby include a half-buried small section of rope, 3 interlocking nylon ties, and a small pink brass knuckles type water pistol. First Nations. Roxanne Thiara, 15, homicide. She went missing in Prince George on the July weekend in 1994. She had worked as a prostitute and told a friend she was going out with a customer. She walked around the corner of a building and was never heard from again. Her body was found 17 August 1994 in the bush along Highway 16, 6 kilometers or 3.7 miles east of Burns Lake. She knew victim Alicia Germain. She was First Nations. Alicia Germain, homicide. She was found murdered on December 9th, 1994 behind Haldy Road Elementary School off of Highway 16 outside of Prince George. Leah was stabbed to death. She knew the victim, Roxanne Thierra, previous victim. She was First Nations. Lana Derrick from Thornhill. She was last seen in October 1995 at a service station in Thornhill. One rumor said she got into a car with two unidentified men, First Nations. Nicole Hoare, missing, was last seen hitchhiking to Smithers, originally from Red Deer, Alberta. Nicole was last seen at a gas station at 5952 Gauthier Road, west of Prince George, on June 21st, 2002 at approximately 2:50 in the morning, talking to a 30-ish-year-old Caucasian male in an orange car. Police investigated convicted murderer Leland Vincent Switzer and searched his Isle Pier property but didn't find any human remains. She was Caucasian, and we talked about that previously. Tamara Lynn Chipman, 22, missing 2005, last seen in Prince Rupert on September 25th, 2005 while hitchhiking east on Highway 16 near the Industrial Park, First Nations. Ayla Sarek Auger. Sarek Auger, 14, was found February 10th, 2006, shortly after she went missing on February 2nd, 2006. A motorist found her in a ditch on Highway 16 near Tabor Mountain, nearly 20 kilometers or 12 miles east of Prince George, was also First Nations. So that is a lot of victims that we just went over, but they need to have their voices heard for sure. This is a very deep story, very disturbing story, I know, not something that I would normally do, but keep in mind all true crime has a sadness element to it. In this case, we dare to wonder why this has been going on for so long and how could we prevent it in the future. That could be the same that's said for all the other victims that the locals talk about that have not been documented or that have been added to some of the Wikipedia pages. If you ask the locals again, they say that this has been going on far longer than what the government has said, and based off of some of the scandals, we would be inclined to agree. I know this story is pretty thick and pretty heavy, especially for the folks back home, because we've heard about this highway in the past, and it had many different names until it was coined in 1998. The only thing that I ask is share the story. You don't have to share my video. You don't have to share the things that are in my video. I don't get everything right. But if you are watching this video and you have heard some stories that aren't covered in here, I would love to hear those in comments. If you don't feel like doing those publicly, you can always send me an email. I would love to hear more about the things that haven't been publicized about this road. So that being said, I hope that I was able to educate you somewhat of the Highway of Tears. And I know we just touched on it from a basic format, and there's a lot more that you could learn about this highway. I'm doing so myself. I hope the information was worth your subscribe and your like, possibly even a comment. I'm your host, Tim Sahlberg. Have a wonderful weekend.